Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century. Where had we left off last week? Well, last week we had, of course, accompanied Hermann Hesse on his journey to Singapore. And this week we are staying on the European continent, and we're not looking at ships this week. We're looking at trains, the other great way of traveling in the 20th century. And we're looking at the writer Paul Morand, a French writer, and we're gonna plunge right into the work for this week because I think it really sets the tone for this week's module. So it's a short story called Catalan Night. I was going to travel with a lady. Half of her already adorned the compartment. The other half, thrust through the compartment door, still belonged to Lausanne station, a town in Switzerland, and to a delegation of men of diverse nationalities, merging into one shadow on the platform and wearing each an eglantine in his buttonhole. Bells jangled. Travellers glided over the asphalt. The scarlet fruit of the signal fell from its latticed trunk in obedience to the timetable. The noise of the whistle pierced the compartment. The lady shook hands over the lowered window. A freckled Britannic hand, a fat German one, the parchment hand of a Russian, some slender Japanese fingers. Finally, a young Spaniard, with a boil hidden beneath his hunting stock, offered a dirty copper ring paw, saying, "Adios, doña Remedios." The crowd opened, a mauve star moved through the breach, dragging in its wake a muffled noise and smoke trail through which the film turned without further waiting, dutiful and distrait. One by one, the train broke the handclasps, its hawsers, and slid onward, thus lightened. I heard a shout, "Vive l'Internationale!" Well, as I said, we're going to be talking about train travel. And not just any old train travel. It's the glorious, magnificent, luxurious train travels of the 1920s with the great express trains and night trains that crisscrossed Europe. Like this one, the Simplon Orient Express, which went from London via Paris, over the Alps to Venice and on to Istanbul. There, of course, in the background, you have the mountains. Maybe this is even Lausanne station. And of course, this is how you would have dined, and actually can still dine to this day, aboard this magnificent train. Of course, today we still have magnificent trains, but they're not quite as luxurious and beautiful as back in the 1920s. So let us travel with Paul Morand on these trains and let him take us back to the 1920s, the interwar years, which really were a time of travel. So here you have actually a poster from that period, or maybe a little later, from the Simplon, the Orient Express. You can see London and then Lausanne right there where Our Lady boarded the train is actually where the line forks. And then on Istanbul you can take also a fork to Rome and all the way on to Cairo or Baghdad. So Catalan Night is one of 5 stories from a collection called Open All Night, Ouvert la Nuit, that was published in 1922 to great acclaim. And all of these 5 stories display really a high degree of exoticism, eroticism, which is very much typical of Morand's literature of travel. You see the table of contents below. Catalan nights are also called Catalonian night, the Turkish night, the Roman night, the 6-day night, and the Hungarian night. So in a way, it's all these stops along those train lines of the 1920s. And you can actually read all 5 stories. I posted a link on iLearn, but you all have to read Catalan Nights. So these stories then are very much a product of the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the urban modernity of the 1920s and 1930s, really the interwar years between World War I and World War II. It's an example of what we call modernist literature that uses images and modernist techniques. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that are very much in dialogue with other modernist artistic currents of the 1920s. And then again, I will talk a little bit more about that later. At the same time, again, we can read these stories very much as a commentary on political currents of the period. We can maybe read them as a harbinger of other things to come, of the descent into catastrophe, 1930s and 1940s, by way of what is sometimes called a languid indifference that we find in Morand's writing. Morand's legacy as a writer is actually very, very, very complicated, and again, I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute, so stay with me. The stories very much engage with the splendor, as I said, of international travel. And, this luxury of these trains is really best captured through these very colorful posters of the Art Deco movement. You have another one here on the left. Art Deco, I'm sure, is a term you've all heard of before. It's short for Art Décoratif, from the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts that was held in Paris in 1925. Now, through application in visual arts, architecture, design, Art Deco really came to represent the luxury, the glamour, the exuberance, and the faith in social and technological progress of the 1920s and 1930s. Art Deco was influenced by earlier modernist currents, such as Cubism, the Vienna Secession movement, Fauvism, as well as what we might call exotic styles of China, or what people then might have called exotic styles from China, India, Persia, and also very much Japanese aesthetics. Some of you might sort of see almost a resemblance in some of these Art Deco posters to Japanese woodblock prints from the Meiji period. And, something that sort of, in a way, connects this visual Art Deco movement or architectural Art Deco movement to the literature that we're reading today is that it's really a transnational aesthetic project. And at the end of our second course stream, I will actually return precisely to that, in which way this literature that we're reading this week also is very much actually transnational. Now here we have a few more of these beautiful Art Deco posters that really celebrate the speed and the beauty, especially of machines, this time of these express trains, these steam engines, these fast trains. And by the early 20th century, luxurious international express trains had really acquired a cult status. They were actually often also the setting for sexual or political intrigue. Novels were written about them, films were filmed on them, and of course, they were a means to satisfy a thirst for adventure, a thirst for travel. So, who is Paul Morand, or who was Paul Morand? Born in 1888, died in 1976. So you see he's about 10 years, 11 years younger than Hesse, maybe not quite a generation, well, almost. He was the son of a very wealthy Parisian family that was very well connected in the cultural establishment of the day. He graduated from the Paris Institut de Sciences Politiques, which is a grande école, so he was really destined for political service. He also attended Oxford University to become a diplomat, really. He married a very, very, very wealthy heiress of a Greek banker in 1927, and, in part, the wealth that he married into allowed him to travel widely, to pursue very expensive hobbies, such as fast cars. Here you have him in a Bugatti. He was into race horses. He was obsessed with speed. and that also finds its way into his fiction. He fostered friendships with a lot of other very well-known writers and artists. Marcel Proust sort of became a bit of a patron of his work. Avant-garde artist Jean Cocteau. Very important, the poet Ezra Pound, who actually translated that collection, Ouvert la Nuit, into English. I posted to iLearn a little introduction that talks a little bit about the translation. It wasn't published until much later, in part because these works were, because of their eroticism, sort of frowned upon in England and America. Ezra Pound was staying in Paris at the time, and he became friendly with Morand, and he really liked this modernist aesthetics. Morand lived in several different European capitals. He also had a stint in New York. He served as a diplomat in Thailand, in London, England, actually, on the eve of World War II, later on in Romania. And he, as an artist, espoused what we might call art for art's sake, which was very much in contrast to more socially aware artists, especially on the literary left, who kind of understood art to have a concrete purpose to better society. So Morand was not really interested in that. He considered himself a modernist whose imagist aesthetics are very much in dialogue with cinema. Very important, the idea of sort of rapid scene changes. You will see when you start reading that story that it's sometimes really almost, in the way it describes speed and the way it describes colors is really reminiscent of the movement of a camera angle. Futurist painting, modern dance, modernist music, all that, he was very much in dialogue with. He has, as I already mentioned, a fascination with the erotic and the exotic, the modern, urban life of the period, architecture, and, the fiction that he produced at the time was really hugely popular and actually also critically pretty, well received. So here we have a short clip of Paul Morand in 1930 after he had written a book about New York, and he's going to speak to us. This is kind of fun, so you'll see him.
This is it. European cities have long inspired American authors, but so much cannot be said of American cities and European writers. For many years, they appeared uninteresting and dull, but this seems no longer true. That is why I wrote the first French book on New York. New York is a marvelous gift of God, the greatest adventure of modern times. 6 million inhabitants cannot be wrong.
So yeah, there you have it, the greatest adventure of modern times. So again, we have this fascination with urban modernity, which of course New York, like few other cities, embodies. I said that he was in tune also very much with other modernist currents, like Futurism. Futurism was an Italian movement that was also very much obsessed with speed and movement and mechanization. It was also espoused by Italian fascists, and that's sort of, no surprise, because as we will see shortly, Morand himself had an admiration for fascism, but this admiration for speed then, and you can see here, this is a famous futurist painting where the painter really tries to capture the movement, right, of the train, providing us different perspectives on this moving object, is something that he tried to replicate in his fiction. So here are a few words about Morand's political views, which, as I already mentioned, are really problematic. So Morand believes that class distinctions speak to the natural order of a civilized society, so that he was a believer that class distinctions were a good thing. Of course, he belonged to the very, very, very highest echelons of society. He espoused nationalist and anti-democratic ideas that were propagated by many philosophers at the time, maybe most importantly by the German philosopher Oswald Spengler. His writings often display anti-communist, xenophobic, racist themes. I already mentioned he was a great admirer of Mussolini, the Italian fascist and dictator, as was, incidentally, Ezra Pound. He was an outspoken anti-Semite, writing in 1933 that, I quote him, "At this time, every country except ours is killing its vermin. Don't let us leave Hitler to pride himself in being the only person to undertake the moral rehabilitation of the West." This is, of course, absolutely horrible. In 1939, he relocated to Vichy and swore allegiance to the collaborationist Vichy government that collaborated with the Nazis after the Germans had invaded France. Morand and his pro-German wife hosted in their Paris mansion many artists who were close to the Nazi movement. And after the war, he was charged with collaboration, but did not suffer actually many penalties. He bid several times to become a member of the Académie Française, which is sort of the most prestigious body in France that is concerned with French language and literature. He was denied a couple of times in 1958 because of his involvement with the Vichy regime, but still, he was ultimately granted access to that prestigious body in 1968, even though President de Gaulle refused to receive him at the Élysée Palace. Now, to this day, his reputation remains tarnished, and we can, of course, ask ourselves in the forum to what degree his political views impact our reception of his writings. And his writings we will take a closer look at in our second course stream. So I will see you shortly.